Fix a bumpy and uneven lawn for good. Chapter 1. Reading the problem before you fix it. Every bumpy lawn has a story behind it, and figuring out that story is the first real step before any soil or sand gets touched. Sometimes it's a trench running along a curb, low enough that a mower never quite reaches into it, which leaves short grass on the surrounding high spots and long uncut grass sitting in the low channel itself, because a mower blade set at a fixed height simply skips over anything below that line. Sometimes the problem is a scattered collection of dips and mounds across the whole yard, the kind that make a mower rock and bounce with every pass instead of gliding smoothly. And sometimes there's a very specific cause hiding underneath, like an old flower bed that used to run along an edge of the property and was later dug out and grassed over without ever being properly leveled first, leaving a long depression behind that shows up every time it rains or every time the mower goes over it. Before getting into the actual fix, there's something worth mentioning once, and then leaving alone for the rest of this. There's a full written guide covering everything in this video and a lot more: soil prep, watering schedules, fertilizing timelines, the whole picture of keeping a lawn healthy year-round. It's over at hankadvises.com if you want something you can keep in a drawer and flip through whenever it's useful. That's the only time that'll come up. Now let's get into fixing the actual bumps. The good news across all of these situations is that the fix follows the same basic process regardless of what originally caused the unevenness. It comes down to filling the low areas with soil, compacting that fill so it doesn't just sink right back down again, and top dressing the surface so grass can grow through evenly across the repaired section and the surrounding lawn. Knowing the cause still matters even though the fix stays similar, because it tells you how deep the problem actually goes. A trench along a curb caused by mower wheels running the same path over and over tends to be shallow and fairly consistent in depth along its length, which makes it a quicker job. A sunken old flower bed footprint is usually deeper and less predictable, since the original bed was often dug out to a different depth than the surrounding lawn and never properly backfilled and compacted before grass seed went down over it. Scattered general bumpiness across a whole yard without one obvious cause is often just the result of years of settling, freeze and thaw cycles, or fill dirt that was never compacted properly when the lawn was first established. None of these are complicated to fix, but knowing which one you're dealing with helps set realistic expectations for how many rounds of filling and compacting a given section is actually going to need. There's also a difference in how visible each type of problem stays throughout the year, which matters for prioritizing which spots to tackle first. A trench along a curb usually stays obvious in every season, since the mower keeps running the same path, and the long grass in the low channel keeps standing out against the shorter grass around it. A sunken flower bed footprint, on the other hand, can hide fairly well during dry stretches and then suddenly become obvious again after a heavy rain, when water pools in the depression and sits there longer than it does anywhere else in the yard. Walking the lawn right after a rain and noting where puddles linger the longest is actually one of the easier ways to map out every low spot on a property before starting any repair work, since some dips are far more obvious wet than dry. Chapter 2. Filling the low spots. Once a low area has been identified, whether that's a trench along a curb, a sunken patch where a flower bed used to sit, or just a general dip somewhere in the middle of the yard, the first physical step is adding soil directly into that low area. The soil gets placed right along the edge or into the center of the depression, depending on where the problem actually is, building the low spot up closer to the surrounding grade rather than trying to lower the high spots around it, which is a much harder and more destructive approach by comparison. This filling step typically happens in layers rather than as one single application, especially on deeper dips. Adding all the soil at once and hoping it settles correctly tends to leave an uneven result, since loose soil compresses unevenly under its own weight and under future foot traffic. Layering the soil in, compacting each layer before adding the next, produces a much more stable and predictable result over time, which matters because nobody wants to redo this same fix again next season on the exact same spot. There's a reason this gets compared to baking a cake rather than just pouring in a pile of dirt and walking away. A cake holds together because it's built in layers, each one settling into place before the next goes on top, and soil behaves in a similar way when it's compacted properly at each stage. Skip the layering and try to shortcut the process with one thick application, and the middle of that fill often ends up loosely packed no matter how much rolling or walking happens on top of it afterward. Since compaction pressure has a harder time reaching all the way down through a single deep layer compared to working through several thinner ones stacked in sequence. Chapter 3. Compacting the fill. Adding soil into a low spot is only half the job, because loose soil that isn't compacted will simply sink again over the following weeks, especially once it gets rained on or walked across a few times. Compaction is what keeps the fix from undoing itself. One simple, low-tech way to compact soil in a residential setting is walking over it directly, applying body weight in a deliberate, repeated pattern across the filled area rather than just casually stepping across it once or twice. It's not a complicated technique, it's really just controlled, repeated foot pressure applied methodically over the same section until the soil firms up underneath. For larger areas or when a more mechanical option is available, a roller attachment on the mower itself can also compact the fill as part of the regular mowing process, especially after seed has already been put down, and a lighter touch is needed compared to aggressive hand compaction. Either method accomplishes the same underlying goal, which is making sure the fill soil is dense enough to hold its shape under future mowing and weather, instead of settling back into a new low spot within a few weeks of the repair. There's a bit of a shuffling walk involved when compacting soil by foot across a filled area, moving in small, deliberate steps rather than normal walking strides, covering the entire filled section, methodically rather than just walking across it once in a straight line. It looks a little awkward, but it's an effective way to apply even pressure across an irregular area without needing any specialized equipment. For anyone working near an edge where a flower bed or border used to sit, that same careful step-by-step approach along the perimeter helps make sure the edges of the repair get compacted just as thoroughly as the center. Since edges are often where a repair is most likely to sink first if they get rushed or skipped over, moisture content plays a bigger role in compaction than most people expect going in. Soil that's bone dry resists compacting properly, no matter how much walking or rolling happens on top of it, since dry particles just shift around each other instead of pressing together and locking into a denser structure. Soil that's completely saturated behaves almost the opposite way, turning soft and unstable under pressure instead of firming up, which can make a freshly filled area feel worse after compaction rather than better. A light dampness, similar to soil that's had a little water on it but isn't muddy or puddling, tends to compact most reliably, which is worth keeping in mind when timing a repair around watering or recent rainfall rather than just working with whatever the soil happens to be doing on a given day. Chapter 4. Redressing with a leveling tool. Once soil is filled in and compacted, the surface needs to be redressed and smoothed so it blends into the surrounding lawn rather than looking like a patch. A tool called a leveling loop, sometimes referred to as a lawn lute, is one option built specifically for this job, and it's dragged across the surface in a smoothing motion that pushes material into low pockets while pulling excess away from high points. A standard flat rake, used with the back or flat side instead of the tines, accomplishes a very similar result for anyone who doesn't have a dedicated leveling tool on hand. The motion that matters here is a smoothing, dragging pass rather than digging or scraping, moving the tool back and forth across the filled area while paying close attention to any remaining high edges or low pockets that show up as the material gets worked. On a well-executed pass, the surface starts reading as genuinely flat, no visible dip when a straight tool is laid across it, which is the actual test for whether a section is done or needs another pass. High edges tend to need just as much attention as the low center of a filled dip, since a repair that only addresses the middle while leaving raised borders around it just trades one kind of unevenness for another. Working the tool across both the high and low sections in the same pass, rather than treating them as two separate problems, tends to produce a smoother overall transition between the repaired area and the untouched lawn around it, which is really the whole point of the redressing step in the first place. Chapter 5. Compacting again with a roller. After the initial leveling pass, a roller, often mounted to or pulled behind a mower, gets used again to press the redressed material down firmly. This step matters for a specific reason, addressing compaction underneath the new surface layer so that footprints and fresh sinking don't show up again shortly after the repair is finished. A section that looks flat right after redressing can still develop new low spots within days if this compaction step gets skipped, because the material underneath hasn't been pressed down enough to resist normal foot traffic and weather yet. If a section does sink again after this process, even after the rolling step, the fix is simply repeating the redress and roll sequence on that same spot rather than treating it as a failure of the original method. Some soils settle more than others, depending on composition and moisture content, and a second or even a third pass on a stubborn spot is a completely normal part of the process rather than a sign that something went wrong the first time. A roller's weight is doing something a footstep can't quite replicate, applying steady, even pressure across a wider surface area in one continuous pass instead of a series of individual points of pressure scattered unevenly across a section. That's part of why the roller step tends to come after the initial hand compaction and leveling, rather than replacing it entirely. Foot pressure and hand tools handle the shaping and rough compaction close to the ground. Working material into edges and corners, a roller can't easily reach, while the roller finishes the job by pressing the whole surface down evenly once the shaping is mostly done. Skipping the roller step and relying only on foot traffic tends to leave a slightly less consistent surface, since no two footsteps apply exactly the same pressure in exactly the same spot the way a roller does moving in a straight line across the section. Chapter 6. Repeating the process for bigger dips. Larger dips, the kind that go well beyond a shallow trench or a single depressed patch, generally need this entire sequence repeated multiple times rather than fixed in one pass. The process is straightforward to describe even when it takes several rounds to complete. Add soil, roll it, add more soil, roll it again, then finish with a leveling pass over the top. Each layer builds the low spot up gradually rather than trying to correct a significant depression in a single oversized application, which tends to settle unevenly and undo the progress made in that one attempt. The target here isn't a perfectly laser-flat surface across an entire lawn. Since most real lawns have some natural variation and minor high spots scattered throughout that don't cause any actual problems. The real target is eliminating the specific dips significant enough to interfere with mowing, catch water, or create the kind of unevenness that shows up clearly the moment a mower rolls across that section of the yard. Patience matters more here than in almost any other part of the process, mainly because progress on a deep dip isn't always visible after just one round. The soil goes down, gets rolled, and the section might still look slightly low afterward, which can feel discouraging if the expectation was a single application solving everything. Treating each round as incremental progress rather than a complete fix on its own keeps expectations realistic, and a section that took 3 or 4 rounds of filling and rolling to fully correct isn't a sign that something was done wrong along the way. It's simply what a genuinely deep dip requires to actually get resolved properly instead of just temporarily masked. Chapter 7. Seeding. And the final top dressing, once the major shaping work on a repaired section is done, seed typically goes down over the repaired area to fill in any bare or thin patches left behind by the digging, filling, and compacting process. A light top dressing of silica sand often follows the seed application, and silica sand in particular tends to work well for this specific final step because it settles in and packs down tightly, pressing firmly into small remaining low spots without disturbing the seed sitting just underneath the surface. This top dressing pass needs a noticeably lighter touch than the earlier soil filling stages, since the goal at this point is a fine, even surface layer rather than another round of significant material addition. A leveling loop or similar tool works well here too, gently nestling the seed into position rather than burying it too deep to germinate properly. Pushed correctly in both directions across the treated area, silica sand handles those last small remaining irregularities in a way that's noticeably more precise than the heavier soil used earlier in the process. The difference between the earlier soil stage and this final sand stage really comes down to grain size and purpose. Soil is doing the heavy structural work, filling volume and rebuilding grade in a spot that's actually missing material underneath. Sand, especially a fine, consistent silica sand, is doing finishing work, smoothing out the last small imperfections left over, once the bulk of the shaping is already done. Trying to use one material for both jobs usually gives a worse result than using soil for the bulk fill and switching to sand for the final finishing pass, which is why the 2 stages stay separate rather than getting combined into one application. Seed placement itself deserves a bit of attention during this stage too, since the whole point of top dressing over freshly seeded ground is protecting that seed rather than burying it out of reach. Seed sitting right on the surface dries out fast and can wash away in the next rain before it ever gets a chance to germinate, while seed buried too deep under a thick layer of sand or soil often runs out of stored energy before it can push a shoot, all the way up to sunlight. A light, even top dressing sits somewhere in the middle of those two problems, covering the seed just enough to hold moisture and protect it from birds and wind, without adding so much material that germination becomes a struggle. That balance is really the reason the top dressing pass gets described as a light touch, rather than another full application like the earlier soil filling stage. Chapter 8. Testing the repair with a mower pass. The real test of whether a repair actually worked is running a mower over the section once the process is complete. A cylinder mower gliding across a properly repaired trench or dip should move smoothly with none of the bouncing or rocking that a bumpy, unrepaired section would produce, that jarring back and forth that anyone who's mowed a lawn full of dips will recognize immediately. Coming off a repaired area and back onto an untouched, still bumpy section of lawn makes the difference obvious right away, since the mower behavior changes noticeably the moment it crosses from smooth ground onto rough ground. It's also worth expecting the repaired section to keep improving gradually over the following weeks and months, rather than looking perfect immediately on day one. Ongoing mowing with a roller attached continues applying gentle, repeated compaction to the area, which helps the repair settle in fully and blend into the surrounding lawn more completely as time passes and the grass fills back in across the treated section. That gradual improvement is worth mentioning specifically because it changes how a repair should be judged right after it's finished. A section that's mowable and noticeably smoother than before. Even if it's not flawless, the moment the work wraps up counts as a genuine success. The remaining fine-tuning happens naturally through continued mowing and light rolling over the following weeks, rather than needing another dedicated repair session right away. Expecting instant, permanent perfection from a single afternoon of work sets an unrealistic bar that the actual process was never designed to meet in one pass. Chapter 9. A few practical realities. Repairs don't always happen under perfect conditions, and it's worth being upfront about that rather than pretending every yard offers ideal working circumstances. Sometimes there are physical obstacles nearby, like concrete edging running along a curb that extends further into the yard than expected, cutting into the available working space and complicating an otherwise straightforward repair. In situations like that, the honest approach is treating the current fix as a solid, functional solution for the immediate season, while planning a more complete correction later on once conditions allow for it, rather than pretending every repair needs to be a perfect, permanent solution accomplished in a single visit. Timing matters too, and not every repair happens in isolation from other lawn issues. Certain pests, leather grubs among them, can be present underneath a lawn during a repair. And the smart approach in that situation is holding off on more aggressive work in that specific area until the appropriate season for addressing that particular pest problem arrives, rather than pushing forward with unrelated repair work that might get undone by an active pest issue happening at the same time underground. It's worth being clear about what a repair like this is actually meant to accomplish in the short term versus the long term. A season where the goal is simply getting a functional, mowable, presentable lawn ready in time for regular use calls for a different level of effort than a full renovation planned for a later date, once root development, pest activity, and other seasonal factors line up better. Recognizing which situation applies before starting keeps the current repair focused and realistic instead of trying to solve every possible issue with the lawn in a single visit, which usually just spreads the effort too thin across too many problems at once. It also helps to think about the calendar in general terms when planning a repair like this. Cool season grasses germinate and establish best when soil temperatures sit in a moderate range, not the height of summer heat and not the depth of winter cold, which is why a repair started at the wrong time of year can do everything right technically and still struggle simply because the seed and the season weren't lined up. None of the physical steps change based on timing, filling, compacting, redressing, and seeding all work the same way, regardless of the month, but the seed's actual success rate afterward depends heavily on catching a window where temperature and moisture are working in its favor, rather than against it. A bumpy, uneven lawn with a trench or a sunken flower bed footprint isn't a permanent condition, and fixing it doesn't require specialized equipment beyond a few basic tools most people already have lying around: a rake, a leveling tool if one's available, and access to soil and sand. What it does require is following the sequence in the right order and being willing to repeat steps when a section doesn't fully settle on the first attempt. Fill the low spot, compact it, redress, and level the surface. Roll it again, repeat that whole sequence for bigger dips, then finish with seed and a light top dressing of sand. Followed consistently, that process turns a trench or a bumpy stretch of yard into a section that mows smoothly and looks like it was never a problem in the first place.